Okay, so we left off, we just added our first actual web form, right? But a web form is really just an HTML page at its heart, okay? And you see that by looking at the source code itself. Ignore that page directive at the top for a moment, but what you see is doc type, right? For those that have learned any HTML, you see that, you know right away you're looking at an HTML5 web page, okay? And then we have our head section, our body section, so standard HTML, nothing really special or particular about it, except maybe that little, what we call page directive at the top, right? So this character here, the less than and the percent sign, and of course there's a closing one that is just the reverse, the percent sign and the greater than, that is right back to ASP Classic, the server-side tag to mark that this is server-side script, right? And then it's a page directive, noting a few things. That the language we're working in is C#. Well, you all know C# by now, right? Yay, good little language, right? A few other things are there. The one we're going to focus on is code behind. So the code behind is the same name as this actual web form with .cs. Now, if I'd done vb.net, it would be .vb instead of .cs. CS is for C#, okay? And notice there's a inherits, okay? First demo .default. So first demo is sort of the namespace. That's the name of the project. Default is the name of the actual page. So where we're going to see that tie in is if I come over here to the Solution Explorer, right? So here's my default page. There's a little arrow beside it, notice? I can expand, and here are a couple of pages. Now we don't really worry about the designer, that just looks after maintaining some code for the design of the page in the background. But here is that code behind page we talked about, right? So this is, it's a standard C# class file. Yay, back to C# programming that we know and love, right? Notice the namespace is first demo, and then the actual class is default. Well, that's why it said it inherits first demo.default. So it inherits this class. Now in the end, this will all get combined into a single object inside the compiled version of this website, right? So the page, the code behind, and the HTML all gets compiled together. And that's one reason why, notice it's a partial class. Have you talked about partial classes in C#? It's a great feature that they added after, I think, version 2 or 3, pretty early on in C#. The only idea of a partial class is it allows you to basically keep writing, adding more to the class in a separate physical file in the file system. So by saying partial class means I can have one file with certain properties, methods, whatever else I want in the class, and then in a separate physical file in the file system, keep on adding more and more to the same class. In the end, it all gets combined together by the compiler, right? So that's the only reason for having a partial. Before we had partial classes in the earlier days of web forms, you'd open up the web form and there'd be like 150 lines of code, all marked with warnings, don't touch this code, stay away. This is generated by the system. If you touch it, you'll break it, right? Well, that's what they got away from. By using partial classes, now all that stuff that is generated by the system, that's standard part of what a page is, we don't have to see it, and we don't accidentally mess it up by changing any of the text in it anymore. So that's all a partial class is. It's just a way to separate one class into multiple files, so the stuff that we don't have to touch and worry about isn't cluttering up the screen, confusing the heck out of us, right? But it is really just a class. It inherits, you notice, from system.web.ui.page. So it gets a lot of capabilities it inherits from that page class is defined in system.web itself, right? All we have here is a page load event, right? And we can write whatever code we want inside here to respond to this as an event. Remember though, this all happens on the server. When the request for the page comes in, it will generate the page and execute any code that's in here, right? So we'll come back, we'll do more in the code behind page in a minute, but let's get back to the HTML part of the page. Remember, they work together, they combine together in the end into a single object. Okay, now I'm just going to point out down here in the bottom left of the screen, when I'm looking at the HTML, the ASPX page itself, notice I have a couple of choices here in terms of what I'm looking at. I mentioned there was a WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get, option. Well, that's the design surface, right? I can select that, and then I basically see, okay, body up here, right? It's kind of showing me with a bit of an outline. That's the body of the page as it exists right now. I can split it as well, so I can see the design surface and the HTML of the page, right? So if I come down here and I type first page, right, you see that it's actually adding that to the HTML of the page as well as I see it on the design surface. Now let me highlight that, come up here, where are we? Oh, I've got some formatting toolbar. I'm looking for my drop down. We keep moving things. Okay, here we are. Right, so if I make that a H1, right? Let me go back to split. See that it's added, so put it in a div and it added the H1 tags around it. So I just want to show that I can work interactively, okay, using the design surface, or I can work in code. It doesn't matter. Any changes I make in code will show up on the design surface and vice versa. Okay? So it's actually a very nice HTML editing tool, Visual Studio itself. People really like it because unlike some of the others, like Dreamweaver, that are out there, they put all kinds of their own markup language in anytime you do anything. Visual Studio doesn't do that to you. It doesn't take over and say, oh no, that has to be this way. It just is a tool that you can actually use to actually create your page nicely. All right, so there's my first div. Now I'm going to come here, I'll just press enter, right? And you see that we get some paragraph tags and so on. Now, of course, one of the advantages of the design tool is using the toolbox. So it takes a moment when I open it first because it has to load the appropriate options inside the toolbox, right? And so we see there's some organization here because there's an awful lot of tools. So there's standard, right? These are the most common ones, so it puts them together here for us. So things like radio buttons, radio button lists, text boxes, and so on and so forth, right? Further down, here's our standard HTML, right? Input, okay? Type is text, type is file, submit buttons, reset buttons, et cetera, right? Checkboxes. So these are standard HTML elements, and there's other sections here as well. We'll be playing around with the data ones starting next week, and so on and so forth, right? But I can just work in the page and type instead of using the design surface. So maybe inside this paragraph here, I will put a input. See how IntelliSense helps me. Type equals text. I'll maybe give it an ID equals now to properly end off a text, because it's HTML5, I have to either use a separate /text tag, or I can use that short form in HTML, right? Where you do the / right before your closing angle bracket. But you can see how now I have a input control, right? Inside of my page, although it looks very small. Designed you out of sync. Click here to synchronize. Oh, there we go. I don't normally use the split view, to be honest with you. I'm either working either in the design surface or in code. But there's my input, right? And maybe I'll just stick on here. I'll go back to the toolbox for a second. I'm just going to put a button. So I'm going to show you I can drag and drop or just even double click, and wherever my insertion point was, it has added a button. Now, notice the difference. ASP button, right? So this is one of those ASP controls as opposed to a standard HTML control, okay? But in the end, it will actually generate. I wanted to do that to show you that when we actually run the page, we won't see ASP in the source code of the page in the client. What we'll see is a standard input type equals submit, right? So let's actually run this. I see it's set for Firefox. Note that I can select what web browser I want to use, but I might as well leave it as Firefox. Loading it into IIS Express, which is the Express version of Microsoft's Internet Information Server, right? And of course it opened on the other window. All right. So there it is. There's my HTML page, right? Now if I view source for a second. Okay, so what do we see here? Well, okay, we don't see that page directive. It starts with the doc type at the top. Okay, a couple of things we'll come back and talk about, but notice down here, there's my H1, input type equals text. Okay, that's my text box, my input, and my ASP button has become input type equals submit, right? So that's the difference. With an ASP control, you don't actually get that ASP code sent down to the client. It will actually determine what HTML is required to do the job of whatever that control is. And that, in this case, is basically working as a submit button, right? All right, now we're going to talk about this view state stuff and so on in a minute, but I'll just close that for now. Let me point out something we're probably all familiar with is if I type something in here, if I click the submit button, what's going to happen to the text? I know it'll be sent to the server if I have a form and so on, but even without a form tag or anything, basically the button's going to submit it back to itself. So it will just basically be doing a circle, getting a new copy of the page. And the text is gone, right? Because the text isn't persisted anywhere. The internet is stateless. Unless I do something to persist that value and make sure it goes back into the page on the return trip, it's lost, right? That's how HTML works. So a lot of the programming that we used to do as web developers is we had to actually grab that information if it was sent, if it was even sent to the server, and then make sure we put it back into the same control before the page is returned in a self-posting page that's posting back to itself, right? I wanted to show you that to show you the difference now. If maybe I'll just press enter here, and this time I'm going to put on an ASP control, an ASP text box, right? So now I have two inputs, okay? Difference in the browser, they look identical here, even if I've used source. Okay, input, they're both just type as text, okay, and that's it, right? However, if I type some characters in each one and click the submit button, the ASP text box maintains state. Oh, you don't know how exciting that is. When in the early days of web programming, that was so much damn work just to get that functionality, and it's just built in to this framework, right? You know, so I don't see a lot of excitement around the room, but if you'd gone through the pain of writing all the code, capturing all the values, putting them back in again on every round trip, you'd appreciate how significant that is, right? Now, I'll just stop running for a second. Let me point out here. So ASP button, okay, there's my ASP text box, and my input type equals text. Now notice it automatically generated an ID, text box 1, and so on. Let's just talk about IDs and kind of naming things. I don't go overboard. Some people say, oh, you should name everything that you add to a page. Crap, right? That'd be way too much work. There is a good rule of thumb to follow. If you're going to refer to something either in code, make a reference to that object, or in the property of another object, then you should give it a proper name. Otherwise, you know, it's not important. You don't have to name everything, right? But it does give us the ability to reference things. So I'm going to talk about, we mentioned that HTML elements, we can actually manipulate them as well, right? And maybe what I'm going to do, this button, besides being a submit button, okay, this system allows us to simulate a regular programming environment. Most of our programming today is what we call event-driven programming, right? You click a button, you pick something out of a drop-down list or whatever, and those actions are events, and then you can write code to execute in response to those events. So clicking a button, you'd make sense that, well, I want to do something when I click this button. A standard HTML submit button only does one thing. It submits to the server, right? But we have the ability to tag on to that functionality with an ASP button, additional event handling. So if I even just point to this and double click, notice it jumped to the code behind page. I should have named it. Bad, David. Right? Here, I'm going to work in code with an object, and I didn't name it. So my rule is, if you're going to refer to it in code or in the property of another control, name it first, right? So it's okay. It's not a problem. I can just delete this, come back to the page. Now, here is one of the most common problems students have. Right now, when I double-clicked on that button, in the source code of the page, the HTML of the page, notice it added on-click equals. That's how it knows that there's a click event associated with this event of the object of the button itself, right? If I were to run now, I'll get a nice, beautiful, helpful error message. Yay! I love error messages, right? I walk around the room, I see students that get a message like this up on the screen, and they panic right away. I've got to get that off the screen. I don't want to see that, right? No, embrace these error messages. They're your friend, right? They tell you what you got to fix to make it work, okay? So it's telling me compile error, right? Default ASPX does not contain a definition for button one click. In other words, I added a reference to some code event handler in code, and it doesn't exist. Oh, of course. Thank you, Mr. Error Message, for telling me what I've got to do to fix this. Whew, boy, I love error messages, right? So come back to your code. Here it is. There's my on-click. So now you know where to look for it, right? It just gets added automatically. And because it happens automatically, it's easy for us to forget that those darn things will be there, right? It happens a lot, okay? You click on something in design view, it adds, for a selected index changed for a drop-down list or something, and you don't even realize it. Oh, I don't want to do that. You take it out of code and you forget to remove the reference in the HTML. There we go. Error message gone. Everything's happy again. All right, now I'll give it a proper name. Right, now I can do that right here. I can just change button 1 to something else. But I want to point out that there's another area of the screen we've ignored up till now, right? If I click on the button here, notice over in Properties, the Properties window in Visual Studio, right? Right now we're looking at properties of that button 1, right? It's another way, yet another way I should say, to go in and change any attributes or properties that we want, right? So, right, I can come down here to the bottom, and that's probably where I'll find it, miscellaneous. There's the ID. So I might call it BTN submit or something, I don't know. Whatever name you give it, something meaningful. Us old programmers, you can see I walk with a cane, right? Us old programmers, we tend to fall into the habit of using these little 3-letter prefixes in front of things, indicates the type. It's really not so necessary anymore. It knows what type it is, and it's easy to find it in other ways, but it's an old habit, and it's not a bad one. If you want to adopt it yourself, feel free. And it's over BTN for button, TXT for text inputs, things like that. It's entirely up to you. I'm not super strict on naming conventions this way. As long as it makes sense, and especially makes sense to you, I'm happy. Okay? So now I've actually named it, and as I click off of there, you'll see here, now it's given it that ID, right? Okay. There's other things you can play around with in properties. Sometimes that's the easiest way to get work done is there. But if I double click the button now, yay, now it's button submit click, right? So this is actually kind of magical. This is part of what's unique about WebForm, is the fact that there's an event handler that actually executes code in response to clicking a button. This is part of that simulation or emulation of having a desktop application sitting in front of you. Because of course this code isn't going to happen until the code gets to the server. So now, when I click that button, it's going to do two things. The standard HTML submit post, right, that happens, but as well, it's going to add with some client-side script a note that there's actually been this event happen of clicking the button. So we need to actually respond to it before we prepare the response to send back. Okay? So I can do whatever I want in here. Now I should also name, right? Because I'm going to refer to it. Here's my ASP text box. So I will, instead of text box 1, txt input. No, I think I used that outsource, didn't I? Yeah. txt ASP input. INPUT. Okay. By the way, I'm terrible at typing. I'm terrible at writing on the board, which is why you'll never see me write on the board, except for that one time today. Okay. All right. So now I have that in code. So let me go to the code behind page. And so I can say txt ASP input, right? And though the IntelliSense already offers it to me, dot text equals hello world. And of course I'm writing C#, so I better not forget my semicolon at the end. Oh. Boy, I'm really messing up, but there we go. So when I click that button, it's going to actually set the text property or attribute of my text box, right, on the server side before it comes back. So I click the button, and there we go. So hello world shows up. Now, of course, if I type something in there, it would be overwritten by hello world when it executes that event handler, right? So it's not the most useful example, but I'm just showing you a little bit at a time the capabilities of the tool, right? Okay. All right. So that shows what we can do. Now, you might have noticed that when I started to type txt, I've got two different things that have that name, and only one showed up, right? The HTML element that I called txt input wasn't available. Let's change that. If I come back to the page, right, this guy here, notice as I click on the design surface, it also highlights it in the code window, right? I have an ID for it. Let's add run at equals server. See how IntelliSense helps me write this? So by adding that to the page, when I come back here, now it shows up in IntelliSense. Because we added that tag, even though it's a vanilla standard HTML element, I now can access it in my C# code, in the code behind, and change whatever I want, right? So txt input dot, now you might think text. I don't think we'll find text. No, we won't, right? Because this is an HTML element. What we'll find are things like, oh, okay. Oh, okay. I'm drawing a blank. Value. That's supposed to be hi, Dave. I'm not going to change it because I like to laugh at myself. Let's do one more. I'm going to come back here. Our heading, remember our H1 first page? ID equals the heading. Run at equals server. So there's the heading. Okay, now because it is a like a regular element, it has inner HTML or inner text, right? I could use either one because I'm just setting the text property. Inner HTML then allows you to actually include HTML tags. So you could be, but it doesn't make sense in an H1 to throw in tags unless you could use something like strong, I suppose. so the inner text of this element, you can do the same with a div or anything like that as well, equals okay. Clicking the button, right? So we see we've modified not only our ASP control, our text box, right? But two different types of standard HTML elements as well. The value of a text input, right? And then the inner HTML of a H1 tag. And that's all done with server-side code. Any questions about that? Okay, well, we're going to carry on with the next bit of our PowerPoint. So we've seen how we can add run at equals server and then change things. It's very powerful. But, okay, the ASP controls themselves. Did you like that animation I did there? I'm going to show that again. Woo! Hey, I spent an hour trying to figure out oh, well, maybe not that long, but you know, PowerPoint is not my first language, so when I manage to get something a little exciting, I like to dwell on it for a bit. Pardon me. Okay. All right. So these ASP.NET server controls, right? As you've seen, we have that ASP namespace as part of the text of the tag itself, right? And at runtime, these server controls automatically generate HTML. So I mean, pretty simple, you know, making a button look like an input type equals submit. But there are much more advanced controls as well, right? That will do all different things. That some generate script as well as HTML, and this is our first chance to see that business of it customizing the response based on the capabilities of the client browser. Different browsers will get different code, right? That works better in that particular browser from these controls. Okay. So they automatically maintain client-entered values between round trips to the server. Now we saw that I could type into that text box. Now mind you, I'll have to change the code while I'm replacing it so it can maintain the value between round trips to the server. And control state isn't stored on the server because that's the more burden you put on the server, the fewer simultaneous users you can support. That's important in web development. You want to be able to scale up, right? So if your site becomes popular and you get more and more people coming at once, think Facebook, right? How do you maintain servers that support all that large number of people? Well, you don't do it by having the server have to remember a whole bunch of stuff for each user that's connected, right? Instead, you put as much burden as possible on the client, on the browser itself, and that's exactly how this is done. There will be a hidden input, which has an encrypted version of the state information about the page, any data entered into the controls and what events have been clicked and so on and so forth. That all gets stored in hidden input tags, so it's just part of the HTML of the page. It gets submitted when the page is sent back again. Okay. And no script is required to actually just maintain the state of the page itself. All right. So we'll view the source again of our page, and I just I'll point out where this code is stored in the actual state maintenance of the page. So I do need to change one thing. I don't want to replace that text, right? Now, of course, I could just comment it out. You're familiar with these buttons up here on your toolbox, right? Comment out the selected lines. Okay, it's great because it doesn't matter. It will see if you're writing HTML, it'll use the right symbols for commenting HTML. If you're using JavaScript, it'll comment that properly and so on. So I like to use that button. I could actually just delete it instead though, because I really don't need this line at all. All right. So if I type a value in here, above a value, right, it will maintain that. Of course, it changed the other things because of my event handler. But if I view source, right, here's that view state. So the value is this big, long gobbledygook right? So it's an encrypted version of the view state information, right? It doesn't really do the user much good to try and steal it. There's no point anyway. They have the page itself. They can look and see what values are entered in. The point is that it is a nice compact way to store the information in the page itself, right? And so that is how the state is maintained automatically without us having to write any extra code in order to do so. Okay, so back to our PowerPoint. Just a couple more slides to go through. Oh, I think I already did that one, sorry. So there's lots of built-in controls. We saw in the toolbar there. There's a whole bunch of them. Many of them are very powerful. But in addition, you can always go out and buy more. There's a whole industry. There are companies like Component One, for example, and there's a bunch of others that Telerik. They are in the business of creating custom controls, and you buy them, right? They'll often sell bundles, like for a couple $1,000. You know, you buy a bundle of controls for one technology or another. Sometimes the bundle will cross. You know, you pay more, you get a bigger bundle with controls for PC development, for web development, for different types of development, and so on. So there's a whole industry out there on creating these custom controls, and you can do it yourself. But there's a whole bunch built in there that, without getting to third party, that we can utilize. Some of the most interesting ones to start playing with right away are the validation controls, right? The validation controls, you're familiar with the concept of validation? Did you do some basic JavaScript validation in your first HTML course? Where you made sure that they entered something in a text box, for example, right? And you probably did like a, you know, if statement, and you checked if there was anything there, and you added to a message to the show or something like that. Yeah. So it's not rocket science to code that kind of validation, but it's tedious code to write if you've got a lot of inputs on a page. I'm sure you'd agree with me on that, right? And it gets very repetitive if you have a lot of different forms and so on and so forth. Well, these validation controls, they make our lives so much easier, okay? The required field validator is the basic one. Basically, it says there's something has got to be entered, or actually, because there's an initial value property, it has to be something is changed from an initial value. So that could just be that something was entered, because if the initial value is blank, right? But if you have something in there already, then you make sure you've changed it from that, which is helpful for things like radio button groups or drop-down lists, where you might have some prompt at the top, select a value, right? As long as they've changed it off of that, then you've met the requirement, right, to actually have done something. Range validator, okay? This is built in, so you just specify the minimum, maximum value, the data type you're looking at. Could be a range of dates, a range of numeric values, whatever, alphabetic values even, right? And then it will just validate that it's in that range. Compare validator is a very useful one. It can be used in a number of ways. You can compare two controls. Think entering the password twice, making sure it's the same in both, right? That's the obvious thing that comes to mind. But you can also compare against a fixed value, okay? So maybe that, the date is, before a given date, right? Things like that. And the compare validator also can be used just for data type checking. You don't actually have to compare it. It's the only one that you can say, I just want to use this to check the data type of what's entered. Have you ever written the JavaScript to confirm that the value entered is a proper date? Yeah? Okay. Was it easy? No. And in fact, a lot of the approaches that you find when you Google solutions for that don't always work, right? So this is great because it just says, hey, is it a date? Yes, no. And then it does the work for you. Regular expressions. Have you done regular expressions before? Or regex, R-E-G-E-X is the short form. If you go to regex.com, you'll find all kinds of documentation and examples of regular expressions. That's not a Microsoft thing. Regular expressions have been around for years. They're supported and used in many different languages. The idea is a way to describe a pattern of characters, a regular expression. So think postal code. Letter number, and so on, or bank account, so many digits, a dash, so many digits, things like that. you can define regular expressions for all those different patterns of characters, and that's a very powerful way to make sure data is entered in a specific format, right? So all of these are there. Custom validator, basically you can write your own code to validate, okay, both client and server side even. And so if none of the others do it, you can always create a custom validator, add a custom validator, and write the custom code. So, you know, think of something like, well, the most common example is usually is a number entered an even number or an odd number, right? You only accept even numbers. Well, a simple expression, a math expression, basically, once you know it's actually a number that's been entered, it allows you to determine if it's even or odd, and then you can say it's valid or not, right? And finally, the validation summary, well, that gives us that, instead of us, you know, we might have 15 or 20 different validators all over the page, instead of us having to go around and find out which ones are complaining and which ones are happy, the summary does that for us, and we'll just list all the error messages from the ones that aren't happy, right, in a single bundle of messages. So we'll quickly round up our demo with showing use of a couple of these, okay? How are we for time? It's almost break time again. Oh, boy. Okay. All right, I'll give you another break at this point because it makes sense before we get into using the validation controls.